Right now, as I speak to you, the Middle East is on the brink of something we have not witnessed in our lifetimes. President Donald Trump has just threatened to obliterate Iran's oil wells and seize Kharg Island, the heart of Iran's energy empire. We are on day 31 of the Iran war, and what started as a military campaign has now escalated into a confrontation that is shaking the foundations of global energy markets. Iran is defiant, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, and oil prices have surged past $116 per barrel. The world is watching, holding its breath, wondering if we are about to witness the most significant military and economic confrontation of the 21st century. Let me take you through exactly what has happened and why this moment matters more than any other in recent memory. President Trump took to Truth Social with a message that sent shockwaves through capitals around the world. His words were unambiguous and his threat was direct. If Iran does not come to the negotiating table and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the United States will obliterate Iran's electric generating plants, its oil wells, and most critically, Kharg Island. Now, for those who may not know, Kharg Island is not just another piece of Iranian territory. This small island in the Persian Gulf handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. It is the jugular vein of Iran's economy, and President Trump has made it clear that he is prepared to sever it completely. The threat is not merely rhetorical, it is a declaration of intent that has fundamentally changed the calculus of this conflict. In an interview with the Financial Times, President Trump went even further, revealing the depth of his strategic thinking on this matter. He stated plainly that his preference would be to take the oil in Iran, and he suggested that American forces could seize Kharg Island in a military operation. Trump compared this potential action to the American takeover of Venezuela's oil industry, signaling that he views energy resources as legitimate targets in this broader confrontation. What makes this statement particularly significant is Trump's acknowledgement that American troops would need to remain on Kharg Island for an extended period. This is not a surgical strike he is describing. This is an occupation of Iranian sovereign territory. The implications of such an operation are staggering, and military analysts around the world are scrambling to understand what such a campaign would actually look like on the ground and in the waters of the Persian Gulf. The market reaction to these developments has been immediate and severe, reflecting the profound uncertainty that now grips the global economy. Oil prices surged above $116 per barrel following Trump's statements, and Brent crude has now recorded a record monthly increase of more than 55%. We have not seen price movements like this since the oil shocks of the 1970s, and even those historical disruptions pale in comparison to what we are witnessing today. The International Energy Agency has declared this the worst oil shock in modern history, and that assessment is not hyperbole. The world is currently losing approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day from Middle East producers because of Iran's selective blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. This waterway is the most important choke point for global energy supplies, and Iran has effectively weaponized it in response to the military campaign against its territory. The response from Tehran has been exactly what we might expect from a nation that sees itself fighting for its very survival. Iran's foreign ministry issued a statement rejecting Trump's 15-point peace plan, calling its demands largely excessive, unrealistic, and unreasonable. This diplomatic language barely conceals the fury emanating from the Iranian government, which views these negotiations as an ultimatum rather than a genuine path to peace. The Iranians have made clear that they will not capitulate under military pressure, and they have backed up their words with concrete threats of their own. Tehran has warned that it is ready and waiting for any ground invasion, and Iranian officials have promised to set American forces on fire if they attempt to land on Iranian soil or seize Iranian territory like Kharg Island. President Trump and his administration appear undeterred by these warnings from Tehran, doubling down on their position that Iran must comply with American demands or face devastating consequences. The 15-point peace plan that Trump has put forward represents the most comprehensive set of demands ever made on the Islamic Republic, and Iran's rejection of it has only hardened positions on both sides. What we are witnessing is a classic escalation spiral where each side raises the stakes in hopes of forcing the other to back down. The problem, of course, is that neither side shows any willingness to blink. Trump has staked his presidency on demonstrating American strength and resolve, while Iran's leadership cannot afford to appear weak in the face of what they characterize as Western aggression against their nation. The Iranian parliament has taken this confrontation to another level by pursuing legislation to formalize Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. This legal maneuver is both symbolic and practical, as it provides domestic justification for Iran's continued blockade of this critical waterway. From Tehran's perspective, the Strait of Hormuz lies within Iranian territorial waters, and they have every right to control traffic through it, especially during a time of war. This interpretation of international law is contested by virtually every other nation, but Iran does not seem particularly concerned with global opinion at this moment. They are fighting what they see as an existential battle, and legal niceties are secondary to national survival in their calculation of interests and priorities. The global impact of this standoff extends far beyond the Middle East, touching every economy and every household that depends on affordable energy. Countries around the world are scrambling to mitigate the damage caused by the loss of 20 million barrels of oil per day from Middle East producers. Australia has already cut fuel taxes in an attempt to shield its citizens from the worst effects of skyrocketing prices at the pump. The United Kingdom is holding emergency talks with energy companies to discuss rationing and conservation measures that may become necessary if this crisis continues. Europe, which remains heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil despite years of efforts to diversify, is facing the prospect of severe economic disruption that could tip the continent into recession or worse. Every government is making contingency plans, and none of those plans are optimistic. Iran's selective blockade of the Strait of Hormuz represents one of the most effective asymmetric responses to American military power that we have ever seen in modern warfare. The Islamic Republic may not be able to match the United States in conventional military terms, but they can inflict tremendous economic damage on the entire world simply by closing this choke point. Approximately 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz under normal circumstances, and that flow has now been reduced to a trickle. Iran is allowing some vessels to pass while blocking others, creating maximum uncertainty in global markets and demonstrating that they retain control over who gets oil and who does not. This is economic warfare on a massive scale, and it is proving remarkably effective at raising the costs of this conflict for everyone. President Trump's comparison of a potential Kharg Island seizure to the American takeover of Venezuela's oil industry reveals much about his thinking on this crisis. Trump has long viewed energy resources as central to national power, and he appears willing to use military force to secure access to those resources when he believes American interests are at stake. The Venezuelan comparison is instructive because it shows that Trump sees a precedent for American intervention in foreign oil production, and he is willing to extend that model to the Middle East if necessary. Critics will argue that such actions violate international law and would set a dangerous precedent for great power behavior, but the Trump administration has shown little concern for such criticisms throughout this conflict with Iran. The human cost of this war has received less attention than the economic consequences, but it remains significant and growing with each passing day. Military operations over the past 31 days have resulted in casualties on both sides, though exact figures remain difficult to verify given the fog of war and competing propaganda narratives. Iran has suffered significant damage to its military infrastructure, but the country's defenses remain intact enough to pose a serious threat to any American forces that might attempt a ground operation. The Iranian military has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, dispersing its assets and building redundant command structures designed to withstand American air power. Any attempt to seize Kharg Island would face determined resistance from forces that know the terrain intimately and are motivated by patriotic fervor. The diplomatic track has not been entirely abandoned, even as military operations continue and rhetoric escalates to new heights of intensity. Various international actors are attempting to mediate between Washington and Tehran, though their efforts have so far produced little visible progress toward a resolution. The United Nations Security Council has met in emergency session multiple times, but divisions among the permanent members have prevented any meaningful action or consensus statement. Russia and China have opposed American military action against Iran while also calling on Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to international shipping. These calls have fallen on deaf ears in both capitals, where leaders appear committed to their respective courses of action regardless of international opinion or consequences. Kharg Island has suddenly become the most important piece of real estate in the world, and understanding why requires a brief examination of its strategic significance. This small island, located approximately 25 kilometers off the Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf, serves as the terminus for pipelines carrying crude oil from Iran's interior fields. Massive tankers load their cargo at Kharg Island's terminals before sailing out through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz to destinations around the world. Without Kharg Island, Iran's oil export capacity would be reduced to almost nothing, which is precisely why President Trump has identified it as his primary target. Seizing this island would not only cripple Iran's economy, it would also give the United States direct control over a significant portion of global oil supplies, fundamentally altering the balance of power in energy markets. The military feasibility of seizing Kharg Island is a matter of intense debate among defense analysts and former military commanders who are watching this crisis unfold. On one hand, the United States possesses overwhelming naval and air superiority in the region, with carrier strike groups positioned throughout the Gulf and Mediterranean ready to support any operation. American Special Operations Forces are among the most capable in the world, and they have experience conducting maritime seizure operations in hostile environments. On the other hand, Iran has heavily fortified Kharg Island and the surrounding waters with anti-ship missiles, coastal artillery, and defensive positions designed to exact a terrible toll on any attacking force. The Iranians have also mined the approaches to the island, creating a deadly obstacle course for American vessels attempting to reach the shores. President Trump's threat to obliterate Iran's electric generating plants adds another dimension to this already complex crisis. Destroying Iran's electrical infrastructure would plunge much of the country into darkness, affecting not just military installations but also hospitals, water treatment facilities, and the homes of ordinary Iranians. Such an attack would constitute a massive escalation that could be interpreted as an attempt to destroy Iranian society itself rather than merely defeat its military forces. International humanitarian law imposes restrictions on attacks against civilian infrastructure, and critics have already argued that Trump's threat crosses legal and moral lines that should not be crossed even in wartime. The administration appears unconcerned with these criticisms, viewing them as obstacles to achieving victory over an adversary that poses unacceptable threats to American interests. Iran's warning that it will set American forces on fire if they attempt a ground operation reflects the Islamic Republic's confidence in its defensive capabilities and its willingness to fight to the last. The Revolutionary Guard Corps has prepared for this moment for decades, studying American tactics and developing countermeasures designed to neutralize American technological advantages. They have invested heavily in asymmetric capabilities such as fast attack boats, anti ship missiles, and underground facilities that can survive even the most intense bombing campaigns. Iran's leadership believes that any American ground operation would result in significant American casualties, and they are betting that the American public will not tolerate a prolonged and bloody conflict in another Middle Eastern country. This calculation may prove correct or incorrect, but it clearly informs Iranian strategy at this moment. The oil shock we are witnessing has no parallel in modern history, and its effects are rippling through every sector of the global economy with devastating force. When the International Energy Agency declares something the worst oil shock in modern history, we should pay attention to those words. The loss of 20 million barrels per day from Middle East producers represents roughly 20% of global oil supply, a disruption so massive that it cannot be compensated for by alternative sources. Strategic petroleum reserves are being tapped around the world, but these reserves were designed to handle temporary disruptions, not a sustained loss of supply lasting weeks or potentially months. If this crisis continues, those reserves will be exhausted and the world will face genuine energy scarcity of a kind not seen since the 1970s. The 55% monthly increase in Brent crude prices represents a massive transfer of wealth from oil consuming nations to oil producing nations that can still export their product. Countries like Russia, Nigeria, and Venezuela are reaping windfall profits, while the rest of the world suffers through higher transportation costs, increased manufacturing expenses, and inflationary pressures that threaten economic stability. Central banks are facing impossible choices between fighting inflation and supporting economic growth, and neither option seems likely to produce good outcomes in the near term. The economic damage from this oil shock will be measured in trillions of dollars, and some analysts believe it could trigger a global recession if the crisis is not resolved within the coming weeks or months. Australia's decision to cut fuel taxes represents just one example of the desperate measures governments are taking to shield their citizens from the worst effects of this energy crisis. Fuel taxes typically represent a significant source of government revenue, and cutting them means finding that money elsewhere or accepting larger budget deficits. The Australian government has concluded that protecting consumers from unaffordable fuel prices is worth that trade off, at least for now. Similar measures are being considered or implemented in countries around the world as leaders recognize that allowing fuel prices to rise unchecked would create not just economic hardship but also political unrest that could threaten their hold on power. The emergency talks in the United Kingdom involving government officials and energy company executives reflect the seriousness with which major economies are treating this crisis. Britain is particularly vulnerable because of its dependence on imported energy and its relatively limited domestic production capacity. The discussions are reportedly focused on contingency planning for various scenarios, including sustained high prices, supply disruptions, and potential rationing measures that might become necessary if the crisis deepens. Nobody wants to implement rationing in a modern democratic society, but responsible governments must prepare for worst-case scenarios even as they hope for better outcomes. The Iran war has entered its 32nd day with no end in sight, and the world must prepare for the possibility that this crisis will continue for much longer than anyone initially anticipated.